We are on to Japan, beginning in 1868. So this is Meiji Japan, which means we are covering the Meiji Restoration, which is a huge part of the story. Come on. When we look at industrialization happening across the world, at this time, Japan is very, very low. They are slow going. They do not take off like others, but they try. China's not on there because China doesn't attempt. The Ottoman Empire stays out of it for the most part. Um, Russia, Italy, and Japan, though, they just really struggle, even Austria Hungary to some extent. Um, but this is a story about why Japan tries. So at this point, when we had left Japan, it was like Tokugawa shogunate, and you had their Japanese feudalism still in place, where sure the emperor was at the top, but literally had no power. Just more of a figurehead. The shogun had all the power, and the samurai were right below, kind of as the elite warrior class that had a lot of privilege, as did the noble elite families, the daimyo. Um, and that's kind of how everything had existed. Japan had also done this inward turn like China, where they wanted to minimize exposure to foreign powers. So they stopped letting people come and visit Japan. They stopped letting the Japanese citizens go like to study or visit abroad. Everything was just kind of locked down in Japan. You couldn't go in or out. So I had a student last year who we went over this inward turn for so many discussions, and he came to class one day and said, I figured it out. I finally figured out how to describe Japan's quote shutdown or inward turn. They only isolated themselves from anybody who had a different enough culture to threaten their own. That's why they didn't trade with Dar al Islam or India, but continued to work with China and Korea. It was really just about protecting their culture from any threats. Spot on. China does this inward turn, and often people will portray it as, oh, China and Japan both didn't talk with anyone. That's not true. Japan 100% was still trading with China and Korea. Like, those are iconic places. I can't remember if they were trading with Vietnam or not, but China and Korea for sure. Um, it's because Chinese and Korean culture are similar to Japanese culture enough that you don't have westernized societies and ideals trying to change or maybe threaten and wipe out Japanese culture. So Japan didn't just not talk to anyone and have one port for the Dutch. They traded with other Asian nations, as did China. It was just anyone who was different enough, they wanted no part of it. There was no reason for them to want to interact with the West when the West was just constantly trying to impose their lifestyle and their ways and their culture on other places. Japan didn't want any of that, so they shut the doors. So when we had talked about Japan, we talked about how there was one port for the Dutch to use, but everyone else in Europe was like booted, right? They couldn't get in, they couldn't trade, they couldn't come visit, no one. Japan shut its doors. Japan has a lot of people though, and that is a relatively great place to want to sell your goods. But again, you'd have to use the Dutch as your middleman, and meant that they were collecting most of the profit off of it. That's when the United States got sick of it. United States is a growing power to some extent. We're playing the game like the rest of the Western world. We're starting to industrialize, or we have at this point. And Matthew Perry arrives with warships off the coast of Japan, and he is ready to quote discuss with Japan. Um, and that's the thing though. He's not really there to discuss, as like I remember learning about this when I was younger, and it was like he rolled up and he was just super excited to meet Japan and had all these great things he wanted to learn. No, he didn't. Sure, he wanted to explore what the economic possibilities were there, but yeah, Japan at this time, they are so isolated that even if you have a shipwreck that occurs like off the coast of Japan, they're not letting you stay in Japan. They're going to ship you out or they'll imprison you. They do not want other cultures threatening their way of life. So when Matthew Perry shows up, um, he is going to come with kind of like, you do this or else, like this ultimatum he is presented. Um, People start wondering what should be done when the Western world comes beating down their door. And on one hand, they had avoided negative interactions with the Europeans by keeping this way of life, but also they hadn't developed. China and Japan are behind because while the rest of the world is being influenced by Europe to some degree and are being propelled forward through this competitive nature with the new technologies, Japan and China haven't experienced it because they've blocked everyone out. And that puts them at a complete disadvantage for the most part. So here is a depiction of Matthew Perry showing up on the shores. Here's an iconic stamp. Again, in America, we celebrate him as his hero that helped open up trade with Japan. But the truth is, he showed up with warships and he demanded that Japan open its ports for trade and to allow the Americans in. We had steam ships at this point, and we needed coal to be refueled so they could keep going. And it was really tough for us to try to make it all the way to China and to trade with the rest of Asia going all that way. So we said, you will be letting us stop here to refuel, and you will open your markets to us so we can trade. It was a demand. It wasn't an ask. It was, I'm going to give you a year to think about this, and then I'm going to be back, and you better have an answer for me. And if the answer is not what I want it to be, you might go to war. The stories are that he even gave Japan a white flag. Like when he showed up to like show them all the new stuff the West had, he even also left them like a white flag as like, oh, here, in case you need this. So if you don't make the right decision and we go to war, you will need this white flag so you can surrender to us. That's your fate. So it's further pressure of the only option you really have is to submit to us, open up ports, and let us refuel here and trade here, or else we're going to rain war down on you. And we have superior technology at this point. So they looked to their neighbor China, who had faced similar things, and China had flopped. China had been taken over. They refused, and now people had been ripping China apart and taking advantage of it. And Japan gets really nervous that that's going to happen to them. So this results in a civil war in China, and eventually you have powers rise up, mostly young samurai that make up this group, and they say, no, we're not going to go the way of China. We have to change. We have to change right now. If we change and we start being competitive with the West and trying to copy them, maybe they'll leave us alone and they won't colonize us. So they have this emperor put in place. They restore the emperor to power, meaning shoguns are gone. Daimyo, samurai, like those are all things of the past. The emperor is now the person in charge. Feudalism is dead in Japan. And they call this the Meiji Restoration. Meiji means enlightened. And the ruler at the time that they put on the throne is like their throne name is Meiji because he's the enlightened ruler. So all of this kind of plays perfectly to the time period. He's only 15 years old when he takes over, but he's seen as a really wise leader that does push for change in Japan so they can kind of like, I always see it as live to fight another day. So manufacturing is the name of the game. So industry is something you have to do. He determines that the only way to protect his country from Western imperialism is to industrialize and transform the military to be more like a European military. They copy the government structures of some European nations. They build a navy and army built off of European models. And they start having a postal system, telegraph services, railroads, all these things that all the other countries in the world seem to be having, at least in the Western part of the world. And the most visual change is the Western style of clothing and uniforms. Like one of the first things we did in this class, maybe the first week or two, was we looked at historical thinking skills and how the Japanese Empire's clothes had changed. Like if you're the emperor, how did those clothes change and that continuity and change over time? This is the moment where we saw the go from the traditional robes and them sitting on a mat to being in military dress that very much looked European. So after industrialization kicks in, it takes them a long time to get going. But then Japan, they will fall in line with what the rest of the world in the Western half is doing, especially when we get to World War I and especially World War II, when we talk about like imperialization and how Western nations are taking over their neighbors and just marching in. Japan gets a hold of that as well. So here's your picture. Here's the same emperor, same guy. This is before and after the actual like industrialization / westernization. Big differences. And a lot of people were upset about this because they felt like now the culture of Japan is gone. It's been pushed, and now we're a Western society, and our rich, amazing culture, which we wanted to protect, it might not be there anymore. So you have all these paintings to show, like, look at how industrialized we are. It's very like Japanese in style, and you even have the blossoms in the back, but all of their clothes look very Western. So it's this kind of like old culture meeting new culture. And then you even have this occurring, which looks very different from when we looked at textile mills for silk back in the day and what they look like, and even what people are wearing. And factory systems start popping up there because they do industrialize. The big thing is look Western, act Western to the degree we have to in order to get the Americans, the Europeans off our case. And once we show them that, hey, we're like you, then maybe they'll leave us alone. Because the biggest worry is that Japan is going to be colonized or forcibly taken over by a European or American power and forced to submit to them and will have no control over themselves. They will have no sovereignty. So it's a really big concern. So that's where we're on for Japan. I'm going to pause again, do this in pieces, and then the Ottoman is up next.